Hello, everyone. This is Josiah with Integrity Syndicate. It's my pleasure to have Ryan with me today. Ryan is a student of the New Testament and researcher, and he was probably on to Lukan Priority before I was. I didn't even realize it, but he'd been making his rounds on YouTube a few years ago, making the case for Lukan Priority. And we just our paths crossed recently, and it's my pleasure to to be talking with him now. So Ryan, tell us about yourself.
Yeah. Well, first off, thanks for having me. I was pleasantly surprised to find the website, lucanprimacy.com. It's a great resource. I'm actually churning through a bunch of the content on that website. And we'll bookmark that because I think it's really important to talk about, that why I was so impressed with finding that, and like the lack of awareness around like counter arguments to Markan Priority just in general in the literature, which that's a whole different, a big of worms. But I'll talk about myself. I grew up Assemblies of God Pentecostal, so I was a pastor for quite a few years. I'm 30. I went to North Central University and got an undergrad degree and wanted to get a master's degree in something. Like I was like, is it going to be an MDiv? I really wanted to be a professor. I still think that's a part of my journey in life, is to teach, historical biblical studies and in biblical historical textual criticism and stuff like that. So I went to a school. It was a Pentecostal school, but it had a lot of great professors. In fact, some of my professors were ex-Harvard professors. Buzz Brookman, who's an archaeologist, Dr. Amy Anderson, who's personal friends with Bart Ehrman, and he's written in her books, and she's written in his, and just really amazing professors. I mean, these are quality people. I think moment of hubris. I do think I went to, like, when I attended this university, it was kind of like the golden era, and then after I left, they had a big overhaul of staff and professors and stuff like that, and department shifts. And so a lot of those professors ended up retiring or quitting or whatever. But they were just amazing professors. I got really, really, really good educational experience. And what that educational experience was essentially a, evangelical version of, German continental European scholarship. And what that is, and for most people who don't know what that is, essentially the birth of like Albert Schweitzer and the quest for the historical Jesus, all that kind of stuff, right? Looking at the Bible critically and trying to understand the historical context and what did it actually mean, and literary devices and all of this sort of biblical studies, biblical academia, kind of was birthed in continental Europe in, into the 1800s ish, give or take. And that is where most of New Testament scholarship really hails from, and even into the 1950s, early 1920s, 1930s, and 40s, which we can talk about a little bit, and how that impacts Markan Priority, right? But I got a lot of that stuff, right? Like I learned about literary devices. I learned about, demythologizing the text, and like why certain people did that, and how like modernity impacted, people's hermeneutic, and like all this kind of stuff. And it was amazing. I felt like I had this really like educated version of Christianity. And I was like, oh, awesome. Like I know all the scholars. I know Conselman, I know Dahlman, I know Schweitzer, I know Gordon Fee, even modern scholars, N.T. Wright. I read the gambit, right? And I felt like the university did a good job at giving me that. Mm-hmm. And, one unique part of my educational journey in North Central was like a really, really great school. A part of my educational path was every student had to go to Israel, which was crazy. The head of the department was like very, very, Dr. Tracy Pano, love him, great pastor. He's been a very influential like pastoral studies professor, teaching people how to pastor contextually in their communities, and like it's just amazing. I have some PhD mentors that would say that they would undoubtedly say that I have the education of graduate degree at this point. Not a PhD or anything like that, But just I've done so much additional curriculum post my university experience. I've taken classes, I've audited classes from professors, top scholars in their field. I've sought them out. You know, it's crazy what an email can do. Just email like, oh, you're the #1 scholar in parables in the world. Let me just find your email, creep on the internet, and I'll just get to talk to you and like get to learn from you. And I've actually given a lot of professors that are pretty well known in their field ideas to basically turn their this was like maybe 6-7 years ago I did this, but I gave them ideas to basically turn their courses into online courses to teach lay people, because you know lay people want to know biblical stuff too. It's not just like people who are big Bible nerds. Like people really want to know what the Bible says and what does it mean by what it says. That's what people want to know today. If you're an atheist or a theist, it doesn't matter. People still want to know what this religious text that has a massive influence on Western society. What does it actually say? Like Jesus says some pretty confusing stuff to Westerners. And, you know, we have all of, you know, Reformed people and Catholics have their very like perfect way of interpreting it, but which I'll allude to in a second here. But going to Israel kind of completely blew up my entire version of what I thought Christian academia was, which we could talk, we kind of pivot into.
Yeah,
but.
so I'm sure you would advocate understanding the New Testament from a first century Jewish perspective. That's
yeah. Understanding Second Temple Judaism is absolutely fundamental to correctly and getting closer to the historical Jesus and the historical Paul. And we'll never get there because, you know, you'd have to be perfect. You'd have to have perfect knowledge. But, you know, I want to come to the text with fresh eyes every time. But I also need to realize that this text wasn't written to me. It was written to a Second Temple Jewish audience, sometimes Gentiles, often mixed. And if I want to understand someone like Jesus, I don't come to him with my prerogative. I come to the text and meet him in his world, in his soil. And if I don't do that, I'm going to turn Jesus into whatever I want to be. And when I was actually at the Church of Annunciation in Bethlehem, and this is very famous, you can go Google search it right now, but you walk through, and it's this beautiful thing, right? It's this beautiful thing where you walk through this like mural outside before you walk into the Church of the Annunciation. And you just see like how every culture, there's like an Asian Jesus, you know, there's the Chinese Jesus, there's a Mexican Jesus, and how every culture has looked at Jesus. And Jesus has the ability to enter into any culture and speak to it, right? And there's a beauty in that. But there's actually some harm in that too, where we turn Jesus into our image instead of letting him change us. Whether you believe in Jesus or not, his teachings are pretty cool, right? They have, if you don't believe in God or anything, his teachings have radical power to transform our society. Look at Martin Luther King Jr., right? He was so inspired by the teachings of Jesus and Gandhi. He completely changed our society because he was so enamored with the person of Jesus. So whatever you believe, like, and I think there's great power in actually understanding his words in context instead of, you know, rationalizing them and turning everything into a literary device. Are there literary devices in the Gospels? Yes. But a lot of times we put them there when they're not actually there. They're just inventions of, you know, 1950 German scholars who didn't have the Dead Sea Scrolls and just made stuff up. Candidly, like that's honestly a lot of times when I read German scholarship, it's like, wow, this sounds like really smart garbage.
Lots of conjecture. Yeah.
Yep.
But yeah. I wanted to get back to your, like, so with your studies, are there particular areas of focus other than maybe Judaism? You're into criticism, obviously, higher criticism, textual criticism.
Yep.
What would you say is your area of the most interest or the most focus?
Yeah, the most focus I would say would be, I want to get better at Lukan Priority. It's something that I know a lot about, but I eventually want to publish like a book that would like, people would be like, oh my gosh, this is shaking academia. But I need my kids need to be like in high school at some point, right? And I actually have quite a strong Bayesian philosophy background, and I think Bible scholars make horrible philosophical arguments. They're so bad. It's just a massive problem. Do they know the knowledge? Yes, they take the knowledge and they form really bad conclusions because they don't understand how to create like a basic syllogism or understand how to form arguments. And that's a huge problem. So I think an interdisciplinary approach to something like this would be pretty wild. I think it would be like a slam dunk in the academic community.
Blend
I want to,
philosophy with scholarship.
Yeah, well, just like
critical scholarship. Yeah.
epistemic reasoning, like having a good understanding of epistemology, like in understanding how we can form, different probabilistic arguments. You can take the evidence for these priorities and run them into a Bayesian theorem. Like, and people who don't like Bayesian theorems, they just don't understand Bayesian. They don't understand Bayes. It's a pretty good philosophical heuristic to help you understand the probability of a different theory over given another one, given the prior data and stuff like that, which I don't want to get into that, but that's definitely something that I would love to introduce. And I think is absolutely necessary. Like you said, German scholars pure conjecture, right? But if you can incorporate some philosophical reasoning, which a lot of the stuff that we'll talk about of understanding Jesus as like a Second Temple Jew, these are all like pretext philosophical arguments to be like, let's check our philosophical hermeneutic. Is it off? That's a philosophical argument, right? And so you kind of have to construct a solid foundation in reasoning
Absolutely.
to come to the text with. And that's something that I think is really, really important and can be missed in scholarship quite even today. Like, Bart Ehrman is a classic, someone who does this a lot, in my opinion.
Almost every error has to do with an epistemological or a metaphysical misconception. And we really need to approach understanding truth itself with the right epistemology, and then we can use a sound hermeneutic to interpret the Bible.
Yep.
And
absolutely.
I totally agree 100%.
Yeah. For example, like Bart Ehrman in a debate, he was like, have you heard of Hanina Mendoza? And was like, oh, he does miracles like Jesus explained that. And it's like, do you realize that citing Hanina Mendoza adds more validity to the historical Jesus? Like, he was a Hasidic Jew, just like Jesus was, miracle worker, controlled the weather, healed the sick, cared about the poor. I'm like, it just, the inability for PhD New Testament scholars to not understand Second Temple Jewish literature and read it and like realize that the Gospels are all Second Temple Jewish authors. Like, Luke is probably a Jew, which we can get into. Like,
yeah, I think he probably is. Yeah.
Yeah, he probably is. Well, first off, he knows way too much. Like, Gentiles don't, even converts don't know that much about, ancient Second Temple Judaism. But I mean, why wasn't Luke in the accusation to Paul that he brought Trophimus in the temple? Because when Luke is writing that narrative, he writes as if he's there. Because, Luke is also with Paul in Caesarea. Oops, that's a 60 AD dating of Luke. Uh-oh. But he's with him there, right? Before he gets, in trouble with the authorities and gets held in Caesarea. And so why wasn't Luke in the accusation if he's like a convert, a proselyte, or, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. And Eusebius claimed that Luke interpreted or translated Hebrews from Hebrew to Greek, and that Paul wrote Hebrews, I think, or at least that Luke translated it from Hebrew. So if he knew Hebrew, it's more likely he was Hebrew.
Yeah. I mean, actually, it's a good question. Do we know of any Gentile in antiquity from the first century that demonstrated knowing Hebrew? That's actually pretty, whoa. Hold on.
We know that most of the early church fathers, the post-apostolic fathers, had no knowledge of Hebrew whatsoever.
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh. Augustine of Hippo, dude. When you learn the facts about this guy, you're like, how is this guy famous? I mean, yes, he's got beautiful theological works, but like, the dude didn't know Greek or Hebrew. Like, what? And he's like a famous church father that everyone's like, you should read him. And then you start to read his parables, and he's like allegorizing them and turning them like the pearl is Rome and all this stuff. And I'm like, dude, I'm gonna like, this is kindling. This just is good for my fire. Like, this is just not good to read.
So let's take a step back. I want to understand how you came to the conviction of Lukan Priority. Tell us about your sort of hold
on. I need to write this down because I need to look into this. Can we demonstrate that Can we demo?
Yeah, it's a good angle to look at things.
Any Gentile knew Hebrew in the first century? Because arguments from silence actually are not fallacious. That's a huge misunderstanding. The lack of evidence can contribute to an argument. So,
absolutely, yeah.
Because if we would expect it, we would see it. If we don't expect it, that does sort of shift the scales. It's not
Jesus
deterministic.
Constantly had these profound I am statements in John. You would think that one of the other gospels would have these central statements about who Jesus identifies.
Oh
himself.
yeah. John definitely is of less historical value, in my opinion. I do think John has some powerful stories that are absolutely like the pericope adulteri. I think that probably happened. I think that was a loose story that was, interjected into John. It probably belongs at I actually know the scholar who wrote like a pretty big, he's a pastor in Minneapolis. Dang it.
Yeah, it could have originated in Luke because
The end of Luke. Yeah. It
I
was
think
at
the
it.
Western text, or there's a few texts that have it at the end of Luke.
Yeah, at the end of Luke. Yeah. And there's also what happens in the narrative is like perfectly accurate to what would have happened. So
Right, and the Greek syntax is more similar to Luke than to John.
Yep.
In that passage. But yeah, let's get back to your story. How did you come to the realization of Lukan Priority?
Yeah. So let's go back into my undergrad for a moment and then we'll kind of progress. So I took a synoptic gospels class, and the class was just full of lots of really great interactions with the professor, Dr. Tim Henderson. I actually still dialogue with him today. He's great. He went to Marquette University, great, but got his PhD from Marquette in Wisconsin. It's a pretty well-known school to get a PhD from. And he does a lot of adjunct professor now and jumps around to different schools. And we learned about, Markan Priority in that class. And basically, and sorry, Dr. Tim, but from what I remember, it was pretty much like, here's all this evidence for Markan Priority. This is kind of like, if you don't think this, you crazy, right? That's how it was presented. Dogma. And, Matthean Priority, like, okay, there's Farmer, he did a really good job of kind of putting it on the map. And then we got to Lukan Priority, and he's like, there's one book on Lukan Priority, but it's not very good, and there's not really any arguments for like Luke being the first synoptic gospel, and that was it. That was it. And I remember thinking when I was in the class, I started to pick apart in the class. At that point in time, I believed in Markan Priority, but me being into like philosophy of religion and like epistemic reasoning, even at this age, at like 20 years old, my friend next to me, he's a pastor still, and a good friend of mine, stood at my wedding, all that kind of stuff. We would like, hey, that's kind of weird. Like, isn't kind of fallacious to say that like because Mark is shorter, that's like pretty much really solid evidence. Like, why couldn't Mark have redacted the text? I was saying this stuff not even knowing anything, right? Just like a 20-year-old kid who wasn't even into Lukan Priority and getting into like Second Temple Judaism, because candidly, I never read Second Temple Jewish texts outside the Bible, and maybe like, Second Baruch, or, a couple of texts, which is a whole problem in its own, like the lack of awareness of understanding the world and the streams of thought within Second Temple Judaism. But like, I hadn't really engaged a lot of that stuff. So I was unaware of like, why does Luke have slam dunk stuff, like historical, Luke is the first gospel to attest to a lot of rabbinic debates that didn't exist until the 2nd century, but it's actually in Luke, like the rubbing of the grains, right? That's another. It's like, why does Luke have all these details that, changed, or Luke gets all these specific geographical and geopolitical lines correct that changed into the 60s. So if Luke was written after, he probably would have gotten it incorrect because he would have been anachronistic, but he's not, though. He actually like would have written correctly 30, 40 years before his time. That's really hard to do. Like, that's not easy to do. So what's going on there? There's like little things like when when Jesus crosses like the lake, when John is captured, he's moving over so that the different prefect is in control so he can get away from Herod, because he's afraid for his disciples' lives. It's like he does certain things like that. It's like, okay, but I wasn't aware of that at the time, but I was starting to like pull at threads, right, for Markan Priority. And that was that class ended, didn't give it much thought. Fast forward my senior year, I get a full ride scholarship to study in Israel. It was a part of my curriculum, and I'm going with scholars from the Jerusalem perspective. So two students of the late David Flusser. So Dr. David Flusser, he is known for two things, really. really creating a movement of repairing the relationship between Christians and Jews, because Christians have done an awful job of, basically the religion that we're connected to, in my opinion, at this point. Like, everything about Christianity is 100% Jewish. And it's a very distinct view of Jewish that evolved over time, but included Gentiles. But he did a really good job at that. How he did that was amazing scholarship. He was the first one to be like, hold on, I'm a Jew, I'm a Jewish scholar. He was also very, 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 very trained in Greek. He actually would go to the Orthodox churches and he would just like speak fluent Greek to them, Koine Greek, with the Eastern Orthodox priests. I mean, there are stories I've heard about him that he's like a savant, basically, was a genius. And when he started to read the Gospels, he's like, this is like a midrash. Like, this Jesus that, I was told, Jews are often like, Christians, but he's like, Jesus sounds just like a Jewish sage. And he started to really popularize the idea that Jesus is a Pharisee on the fringes, right? Not a card-carrying Pharisee, but he's a Pharisee who sounds a lot like Hillel, one of the Pharisaic houses. And he also is very Hasidic in how he treats women, which is with a lot of respect and dignity, and how he performs miracles and cares about the poor, which the Hasids were known for doing. And so he kind of pioneered that movement of understanding Jesus within Second Temple Judaism and put it kind of on the map, which is a huge problem with continental European scholarship up until this point, because they didn't do that. And that is where you get things like Jesus is the charisma. Have you seen that meme where it's like, and then Jesus says what? It's like those funny memes that people make about German scholars and stuff like that go run amok on like Reddit and stuff like that. Because some of the things that these German scholars would say don't resonate at all with the world of Second Temple Judaism. They're completely foreign, and they're completely, Western ideas that they're completely pushed into the text. And so I studied with these scholars in Israel for over a month. So we did archaeological digs. We did classes every day and night. And the different archaeological sites that we went to all connected to the text. This spanned everything from the Old Testament to the New Testament. And the trip ends in Jerusalem. So you get to really understand, obviously the if you go to Israel and they say, oh, this is where this happened, that's not true. We don't know any of that stuff. And these scholars were like legit. They're like, we don't know where the Garden of Gethsemane actually is, right? Like, there is a fake Garden of Gethsemane for Catholics to go to, but it's not like, we don't actually know that stuff. We do know some other things based off of large, pieces of land and things like that. Like, I went into Hezekiah's tunnel, but what they call Hezekiah's tunnel there is not really actually Hezekiah's tunnel. They think it's like much lower, because archaeological tells, civilizations just continue to build on top of each other instead of like going somewhere else and starting from scratch. Why not just build on the foundation already there? So like, much of the history that we know that Jesus lived in was much, much more beneath the ground. There's actually one spot that we know that Jesus actually touched. It's because he walked into the temple, and there is a step into the Second Temple that's outside of the Temple Mount. There's only one of them, I think, that they've uncovered. So anyways, I'm getting on a tangent here.
Yeah. Let me follow up on a couple of things you said. One of them is, Mark is shorter. I hear like, university type professors always say, like, that's the first thing they'll say is, oh, it's shorter. It doesn't have an infancy narrative, and the resurrection narrative is really abbreviated, so therefore it must be earlier. How do you get past that sort of hurdle and just the overall size factor and in proportionality, because Luke is actually the longest gospel of the four.
Yep. It's actually Luke Acts is like the 30% of the New Testament. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I've realized is that when you isolate the material that's a parallel, that Mark is actually almost 50% longer.
His sentences are longer and have more details. Yes. And you don't even need to be a scholar. Just open up your New Testament and read the Gospel of Luke and then read Mark. And it's like, it's astounding. It's astounding that Mark has longer sentences, often adds finer details, right? He'll say it's a stick in a bag and this. It's like, why would Luke just omit details that would add credibility to his case? It's weird.
So yeah, you can't really. It's not the comparison of the overall length. It's the comparison of that material which parallels, and we see that Luke is much more primitive and abbreviated as compared to Mark, which is it's more crafted in a way that makes it engaging, interesting, dynamic, more dramatic, more dialogue. And so we see that there's actually an embellishment, or a evolution of what seems to be the primitive narrative in Luke, to Mark taking it into like a
Yeah.
midrash type of remix of
Yep.
Lucan material that's more in some cases, you know, a little bit more strange, but that captures the imagination, and adds an element of drama and intrigue
100%.
to the
And
story.
absolutely. I don't think Luke is in the genre of Greco-Roman biography. I think Luke is in ancient history genre. He reads more like Josephus. I don't think Luke used Josephus. I think that's an erroneous conclusion for lots of reasons. It also is very presumptuous to be like, oh, Luke was, couldn't have known this stuff. He got it from Josephus. How did Josephus know it? Come on, stop.
Okay, so yeah, just briefly, since you mentioned Josephus, what would be your main arguments that there's no dependency on Josephus?
Language. There's no language shared. I mean, it's like literally the people who talk about that, he's a doctor like Stephen Barnes or something. I've seen him. What's his name? There's one scholar who's like really big on this. They'll use these arguments for Markan Priority of like shared language, dependency. Guess what? Luke and Josephus don't have none of that. So like, how could they use that as an argument for dependency over here? And then when they write their dissertation for that, there just isn't. And he actually addresses this and kind of hand waves it away. That is like the Achilles heel of your argument. If there's dependency going on, we'd have some shared language. There's very little shared language between Luke and Josephus. And I think it's very presumptuous to assume that like Luke wouldn't have gotten this on his own, because that accusation to Luke cascades onto Josephus. Where did Josephus get this information? It's just like passes the buck. And so a lot of times, again, look, basic epistemic reasoning. If you make an accusation at Luke as an author and you just rely, oh, he, probably wouldn't have known that. It's too crazy. He got it. He got it from Josephus. Well, how did Josephus get it? It's just like, it doesn't make any sense. Like I think they both independently know of these, events. Like I think there's one of like Herod shining with light or whatever when he died. Like if that were actually a story that Josephus would have gotten from people, why couldn't Luke have? What's so crazy? It probably was like a rumor that spread around, right? It's,
There's also,
life isn't that exciting at this time. You know what I mean? If that story goes around, it'd be like, oh yeah, I remember when. Like everyone would have known that. It wouldn't have been like something you have to get from a different author. So
yeah, it's a pretty weak argument just to say, oh, because we have Harold, being mentioned and described, and we have King Agrippa, being described in Josephus, and the Pharisees and Sadducees being described in Josephus, that somehow there's a dependency. And it could be the case that Josephus and Luke are to some extent using some other source that predates Luke in some aspects, but it doesn't do a thing to establish that Luke is dependent on Josephus. Yep. One of my main arguments is that First Clement has at least 2 direct quotes from Acts, and First Clement obviously predates Josephus. So that's one.
Ooh, I did not know that. That's pretty cool. Wow. James Kugel, The Bible as It Was. He's a Harvard professor. Amazing book. Highly recommend reading it. He is a Second Temple Jewish scholar, and he talks about Jewish interpretive techniques during the Second Temple period. And there's a lot of crossover with the New Testament. Obviously, Paul, right? Paul does a lot of this midrashim going on in the text, but he has a phenomenon that has nothing to do with Markan, that he doesn't connect to Markan Priority, but knowing the things that we know, he has coined the term the Bible retold, that Jews would essentially take very long passages in the Old Testament and they would redact them to make them a bit quicker, a bit more dramatized, and shorter. And we see this in Josephus, actually. He does this with the story of Jonah. And it's a very great way to kind of dramatize a longer text. Remember, Luke is one of the longest texts in the New Testament. It's very long. And it's a way to kind of share it briefly, either in written form or as a sort of sophist manner, where we do know that Jews would kind of take like the primeval narratives in Genesis and like turn them into a fun play, and they would kind of perform them for not just Jews, but even in the diaspora. And so I think that this phenomenon that is uniquely Jewish, I think that whoever wrote Mark took another text, and it could have been Luke, it could have not been Luke. Let's just leave that out of it. I think Mark took something and redacted it and dramatized it and turned it into something that would be easily shared in public, would be more engaging in public, like in a public like this, like if people were sitting around us listening to us, or a play. And this is something we know Jews did. We have evidence for all of this stuff. And we have Mark and Luke, which fit the mold pretty well. So I think this is a very good hypothesis to sort of describe what Mark is doing, because we know that Jews have already done it. We have evidence that they've done it. We have textual evidence that they've done it. And we know that there's a purpose for it in society that they would have done it in. And so we kind of have like a perfect answer for why Mark would have done this, because a lot of people are like, who writes a shorter gospel, blah, 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 blah. Well, probably because it's not meant. Luke is dry to read out, you can't make a play out of that.
Yeah,
Mark would have been a very good
boring, probably of all four.
Yep.
And that's an indication of its primitive nature, is that it's not spiced up and doesn't have that extra sauce added to it.
Yeah, and I want to respond to one other point there too. So we talk about like the primitive, or like the supposed primitive resurrection narratives. I think what's really interesting is the scholars who claim that also know that Paul claims basically a resurrected Jesus in 40, in 55, in the spring of 55 in 1 Corinthians. I mean, that no scholar disputes that, right? And so we have 1 Corinthians being written, which I believe is 55. I have to check the Gordon Fee commentary up there, but because we know, pretty much we know when he wrote that one. And we have it that early, but then the same scholars who claim that about Mark also claim Mark was written around 70 because of the temple prediction, which is another thing we could talk about. But how does the Christian movement that we know for sure, at least by 55, there's an empty tomb, and then we have Mark write his text, right? So a lot of scholars claim, there was no, the reason why Mark wrote it that way is because there wasn't a developed view of the resurrection. But we know that the view that those people claim about Mark written in 70, we know that they also claim Paul knew about an empty tomb and like a resurrected Jesus in 55. And that was like a popular view in the church. So you have like a contradiction going on with those people, because they have, Mark is more, primitive with his resurrection narrative. It's written in 70. But we have Paul in the entire church that Mark would have been written for in 55, claiming that there's already a popular view of the resurrection. So I feel like it's a contradiction. They're holding all these different views that don't go together. And so you can't compromise the 1 Corinthians, because it's just like, that's the gold standard of scholarship. Like Paul wrote it. It was in 55. Like anyone that disputes this is crazy. Yeah. And
the sequence of resurrection appearances in 1 Corinthians matches Luke Acts.
Yeah.
Better than the other Gospels.
Which I think Paul was a source. If Paul was alive, when did he die? 60, 61. Luke is like 59 to 60. Probably, I think Luke, Acts was probably written together. Well, I think Luke was probably written while Luke was in Caesarea, which is, I've been to Caesarea. It's not that far from Jerusalem. You could easily have made it to the Galilee. It's like a 20-minute bus ride. So you could have literally, journeyed while Paul was in chains for 2 years. The dude was in jail for 2 years. That's boring. What are you going to do? Hang around with him all day? No, you're going to go and, write your gospel and have access to eyewitness testimony, which there's now Markan Priority coming out and saying that, there's, Luke is full of this eyewitness testimony. How could those eyewitnesses have been alive in like 80? They're dead. They would all have been dead. So all these like hoops that are jumping through. It's called like the poker tell, how we know Luke used eyewitness testimony based off how it was written and stuff like that. And the person who wrote that is a Markan Priorist. And like, there's also more Markan Priorists who claim that the passion narratives of Luke are the most primitive, like the trial and everything, but they're
Yeah,
all marked. It's like
definitely the trial.
how yeah, the trial. Yep.
So there's a couple elements in Luke, and my claim is, I did the critical edition, the AI critical edition, where I mapped out all the textual variants, and there's the so-called Western non-interpolations, which if you take those out of the last few chapters, the um, the resurrection narrative and the passion narrative is much more primitive than the traditional version of Luke that we all read. So it's likely that Luke had undergone some interpolations in the first few centuries, and what we have in the traditional text isn't really the original text. But if you scale back those Western non-interpolations and other interpolations, that we get something that's more primitive, that's clearly more primitive than what we perceive it to be in the versions that we read.
Yeah. Yep. And like I think CH Dodd, I think it's CH Dodd or Dunn. I think it's Dodd, who claims that like in one of his recent works, that like Lucas has a more primitive passion narratives. But again, these are all Markan Prioritists, and they're saying all these things. It's more primitive. Eyewitness testimony. It's like, you know what explains that data? Luke is written first. But no, Mark was written first, but like Luke somehow, jumped through all these hoops and like did backflips and stuff. It's again, coming from a Bayesian analysis, the probability is just plummeting when you start to do that kind of stuff. But I think there is a large effort to maintain Markan priority in New Testament scholarship because it's been the dogma, which, that's a whole nother beast of like, where did Markan priority come from? Like, it's a very sus where Markan priority comes from. That dogma then like snowballed and it became this massive thing that most people don't have the tools in their tool belt. Even PhD scholars are not good enough linguists to go into these debates and actually figure it out and start to get into the textual analysis. They just kind of assume, like, if you talk to any graduate student, a lot of them will say, yeah, we had like a day or two on Markan priority, and everyone's like, oh, Markan priority, let's move on. That's essentially, I've heard that story so many times at top schools. It's
What would you
mind-blowing.
say the top three arguments for Markan priority?
I would just say that the most compelling argument is, well, Mark was written in like basically Common or Koine Greek, and it's sloppy, and people edited it and polished it up. That's what I think would be the most I think like if I were to pick one main argument that carried most of the weight, it'd be like, oh, Mark is just poorly written. It's sloppy. It doesn't look like, and it looks like Luke and Matthew cleaned it up. For most people, that when they go to school and they sit down in the class and they sit in a seat, right, and they're learning about Markan priority, that seems pretty convincing in a vacuum. I don't think Mark is cleaning up Luke. I think Mark's authorial intent is probably different than Luke's, because Luke is a genre of ancient history. And so I think it's just a totally different intent they're going on. I don't think Mark's prerogative
this
is to clean it up.
characterization that Luke and Matthew is cleaning up Mark is not a correct one. It may be perceived that Matthew's cleaning up Mark, but it doesn't apply to Luke.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess honestly, I think I would say honestly, when you're sitting down in the classroom, the most compelling argument, like you can get into the nitty gritty ones, but the most compelling one would be, oh, Mark is shorter, Mark's sloppier, and again, a lot of these graduate students, they're not digging into the arguments. They don't have the tools.
They're all
to dig into the
superficial.
arguments.
Like, yeah, it's Mark doesn't have an infancy narrative. Number one, okay, well, maybe he wanted to have a dramatization of Jesus's life. He didn't want to have an infancy narrative.
Yeah, that's another one too. I think that contributes to the shortness of it too. Is like, oh, if you have an infancy narrative, it's just going to be shorter.
Or it's just shorter, but they're not comparing the parallel material. They're just comparing the overall length, which isn't an apples to apples comparison. You look at the actual parallels, and Mark is immensely longer. Like if you were to just extract the parallel material, you'd have a much thicker book of Mark than you do of Luke. So that's a misconception or misperception. The passion narrative, or especially the resurrection narrative, is another one, and that could be explained again by just understanding that Luke is actually more primitive than it actually appears in most translations, because what we have is what is likely a later tradition of Luke, but there's evidence of interpolations that would make the passion and resurrection narrative much more primitive than it appears to be. Those would be my main arguments. Now, there's a lot of Aramaic words in Mark that are infused, but wherever it's infused, there's a Greek explanation of what those Aramaic words mean. So that appears not to be an indication that just because it has some Aramaic terms that it's more primitive, that it's just infusing Aramaic lingo to give it a sense of contextual richness to
Yeah, I've heard that
improve
argument.
the
Well, Mark
narrative.
uses it to kind of make it seem like demure, Vogue or something. Yeah. I've heard that before as well. Let me see.
And then getting back to one of the reasons why Acts is not dependent on Josephus is because there's evidence that there's a literary dependence of Mark on Acts. So Mark likes to remix words and pull words in from different sources, and one of those sources is Acts, to where specific terms are kind of grafted into Mark that were taken from Acts. I have an article on that at lukanprimacy.com.
Yeah, I'll have to check those out. There's definitely some which I want to, this is maybe a good time to point that out. I feel like a lot of this stuff, right? You're in class, you're hearing this stuff, and it makes a massive impression on you, and it creates a massive bias in you. And I was biased towards Markan Priority, and I debated with Mark Turnage. I don't know if you know of his name, but he contributes to the Jerusalem Perspective website. He's got a lot of great works. Definitely check him out. I got a bunch of his works up here. And he's a Second Temple Jewish scholar. He actually leads tours in Israel. He led my trip along with Dr. Stephen Notley, who is the preeminent scholar on parables in the world. He actually published a book maybe 10 or so years ago called Parables of the Sages. Highly recommend that book. Just going over all the different parables in antiquity, and you see a lot of parallels to the Jesus we find in Luke. I mean, yes, Matthew and Mark do have great historical information as well. But again, there's just, it's wild how Luke consistently and accurately would have corrected Mark's geography later. Like, that is so difficult. That's not easy to do. That's not like, oh yeah, he just did it. Like, that's a task that is improbable to have happened.
Now there's, I claim another argument. This is the Jerusalem school, is that the Greek syntax of Luke is largely more Semitic than Matthew or Mark. And obviously we see areas where Luke is less Semitic in its Greek syntax, like the prologue. But when it comes to the special material, most of the special material is even more Semitic in its syntax than Mark and Matthew.
You can even see it in the English when you read it. Like, a lot of people, I just tell people, read Luke in English, and you can tell the way Jesus talks is different. It's more Hebraic. Even it comes through, especially in the NASB. I use like I use an NASB from before the NIV came out, because the Lockman Foundation changed the translation to be more like contemporary. But if you use like an older NASB, like for people who don't know how to read Greek, and compare like the Vorlage or the Semitisms going on and all that kind of stuff, you just read Luke and you're like, yeah, in Luke, Jesus sounds kind of like just a rabbi, a Jewish traveling sage. And in Mark, he doesn't sound like that. He sounds way different. And in John, he doesn't sound like that, right? It's a whole different beast. But when you just read the plain text of Luke, even in English, you can tell that it's much more Hebraic and sort of its idioms and stuff like that going on, or with how the Greek comes out in the sentences come out in English. Even you can sometimes still feel it when you read it. So
yeah, and the place where we see sort of the most strongest initial sort of advocation for Lukan Priority is with Robert Lindsay and his introduction or preface to his translation, his reverse translation of taking the Greek of Mark and translating that back into Hebrew. He found that it's extremely problematic. The syntax is terrible for translating it into Hebrew from Greek. And he noticed his default position was Mark was probably the first. That's why he attempted to translate Mark. It actually proved itself not to be the case, and that Luke has a Greek syntax that is more Semitic, and easier to translate back into Hebrew.
There's that story where does he say Eureka? There's like that. I don't know if you've read the story of like when he came to the moment of like, oh my gosh, Markan Priority's not true.
Yeah,
Like
it's
it
like
was
this
like a
huge
big deal. It was like a big
veil,
deal. I
like
mean, it's a
lifted.
big deal.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it
'cause
is.
it's like the Pope, you know, it's like the Pope of academia. You know what I mean? It's a dogma. It's a very strong dogma in New Testament scholarship, and it's wild how kind of weak the arguments actually are. Are there arguments? Yes. I'm not trying to say like people are crazy, but it's not as strong. And I think it's, you know, again, repeating myself here, repetition's the greatest teacher. People don't have the tools to dig into it. They hear it even in graduate level courses and just kind of take it for face value. But when you start to dig into it, it's not as strong as you think it is. And I think it's problematic because a lot of New Testament scholarship is predicated on Markan priority. A lot of it, because you have the Markan Jesus, and that's like the more primitive version. And like the Lukan Jesus, he's embellished more. And that's kind of what happens in the literature, you know, from then on until now, right? And we still see that in a lot of cases. Now, scholarship is kind of like changing a little bit. Like people are getting more comfortable with like understanding Jesus with the Second Temple Judaism. Like, you know, the Jewish Jesus has kind of become like a talisman in scholarship to feel cool and stuff, even though they don't even read the Mishnah or anything. Like, have you read through the Mishnah? No. Well, wow. Like, just mind blowing. So it's really interesting. I want to get back on track though. We kind of went on a couple tangents, and I kind of want to get back on track on how I kind of had my own eureka moment. Would that make sense at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I wanted to ask, like, what was the one thing that really just pushed you over the edge to be like, oh my gosh, I was wrong about
Yep.
this?
So I went to Israel and I studied with this scholar, and there were other PhD scholars there on the trip. And Mark Turnage is an excellent scholar. He's actually finished his PhD under Estelle Escher. She was a Dead Sea Scroll scholar. I might have mispronounced her name, so apologies there. But he was my main guide, and I would stay up late. I was like, you know, I was the kid that sat at the front of the bus because I was like, what is going on? And we would just talk and talk and talk. I was very Protestant in my beliefs, right? Like understanding Jesus through the Protestant lens, even though it was more like text critical. My entire version of Christianity completely exploded. Like once I started to understand who Jesus was and his parables and everything, and understanding like, why did Jesus say your sins could be forgiven if you forgive your friend, God will forgive you? That was before he died on the cross, right? Like all of these, like, whoa, I was very Pauline in my understanding of Christianity and not understanding Jesus for who he was as a teacher. And it completely imploded everything. And it started with understanding the arguments. So first it started with understanding that Jesus didn't speak primarily Aramaic. He spoke primarily Hebrew. And the amount of evidence for that is, again, absolutely insane. You know, here's a couple off the top of my head. We have first century contemporary to Jesus water jugs of average day farmers. They would write their names on the water jugs to work in the fields. Were those water jugs written in Aramaic? No, they're written in Hebrew. All right, another one. First century tombs dated from Gabi Barkay, who is the #1 scholar on ancient tombs in Jerusalem. Took a class with him when I was there. It was like a seminar. We have tombs that have warnings for robbers, curses. And robbers typically are not educated people. They're commoners. What was the curse written in? It was written in Hebrew, not in Aramaic or Greek. It's written in Hebrew. Additionally, parables, which are Haggadah. Haggadah is essentially Jewish interpretation of Torah for common folk. It isn't the academic stuff, it's the common folk stuff. And Jesus kind of very expertly shifts from halakhic teaching when he's teaching to the, you know, teachers of the law to parabolic teaching and Haggadic teaching with the masses, which is why they liked him so much. He probably was very fascinating to listen to. His parables probably were very, very, you know, charismatic. Parables, not a single parable outside the Gospels is written in Aramaic. Every single parable ever outside of the Gospels, it's in Hebrew. It's like, okay, that's pretty insane evidence. So, geez, you're telling me that all the evidence,
know that every parable is in Hebrew?
there is not a single parable. For example, in the Aramaic Targums, when it recites parables, it switches from Aramaic to Hebrew. So there are no Aramaic parables in antiquity. And so,
Oh, you mean outside of the New Testament, outside
of the New Testament, which we know the New Testament's written in Greek. But I mean, given what we've been talking about, it's very obvious that the New Testament's based off of some sort of Hebrew source or Hebrew background, given the Semitisms we see in the text.
So explain your theory on how the synoptic gospels emerged. If there's a Hebrew tradition that predates it, or that
I'm not super developed there yet. I think the most obvious, there's the whole anthology. Are you familiar with like the anthology and all that? I think at some point, however you get to that, I think that there was a proto-Hebrew narrative of some kind that Luke found and used as a base, and then kind of built additional pieces. And then, Acts
he
obviously
wove bits and pieces from a Hebraic source. And so there's
I call it a proto-gospel, a proto-Hebrew gospel. It's not Q, it's not a saying source. It's some sort of narrative source that has teachings, some narrative, some sayings. It's much more primitive than what we have in Luke, because Luke is obviously a lot more compiled, and obviously Acts is massive as well. Like, I don't think there's a Hebrew source for Acts behind that.
In the prologue of Luke, when it says many have undertaken to compile a narrative, he's not referring to Mark and Matthew. He's referring to these other earlier sources that he's trying to set the record straight.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. To some extent, we've all been in that position of really wanting to know the truth and knowing the details and the facts. And I think Luke does an excellent job at compiling that for us. And it's historically reliable.
Without Luke and Acts, we would be definitely in a much worse position to kind of.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I was actually with an Anglican priest the other night. Sorry to interrupt you there, but what you just said, we were talking about, I was talking about Luke, Acts, and how much we were talking about Markan Priority, and it was really fascinating discussion. And I basically told them, if we lost Luke, Acts, I feel like you kind of lose a massive, not just 30% of the New Testament, but you lose a lot of the historical Jesus. And they're like, oh, if you lose Mark, you do too. And I was like, no, you don't. If Mark disappeared from existence and from my memory, it wouldn't matter. If I lost Luke, Acts, you lose a massive part of Christendom. It's completely disruptive because Mark doesn't have a lot of good stuff in it. To be honest, it's kind of it's not a great,
it's a remix of primitive Lucan content.
Well, yeah, it's a great play. I would have gone to my local, performing arts center to go watch it, but I wouldn't have bought the book.
It's a great
Amazon Books and ordered it and read it, with a cup of coffee on a Friday night.
Exactly. It's a great comic book version of selected elements from Luke.
Yep. That's a great way to say it. Yeah. Through that process of understanding how I got to Lukan Priority with them, was I understood that Luke contained the content that best fit for a Jewish sage in 30 to 40. Given the Mishnah, given the Hasidic literature that we have, and given other parables of contemporary teachers that we, some of this stuff is like from 150, 200, but we know it's like been recorded orally, or these are scholars who are like agnostic to this debate, right? Like, we have parables in contemporary in 50 BC and all the way up to 100 AD, etc. Luke fits a better historical Jesus and gets better geographical information and understands better geopolitical stuff. I started there, and I started to realize, how could Luke consistently and accurately correctly preserve this information against Mark and Matthew? And if Mark were his source, and how could he consistently and accurately correct it? Seems very unlikely. That is a pretty persuasive argument without getting into the details. It started to kind of pile up, where I realized the Jesus we see in Luke is much more accurate to a historical figure than we see in Mark. And for Luke to find that and correct it later would have been as a greater feat than to have just been first. And that's what kind of spun off digging into like the different arguments for, the spurious emergence of Markan Priority, like understanding that Mark was kind of made as an like Markan Priority was like an anti-Catholic thing. That essentially, if Matthew wasn't the first gospel, which was like kind of the dominant view for the first like 1800 years of the church, that if we can say that Matthew embellished on Mark, then we don't have a pope, because we don't have the claim of Peter saying that Jesus was the rock. And so Protestants popularized Markan Priority to basically fight against Catholics, because that period in history, the Catholic Church had political power in the world, not just like a religious authority. And so Protestants really fought with Catholics on this. And that was one way for them to kind of have an argument to dismantle them. And that became a dogma for them to hop on to fight against the Catholics. And so that when I started to realize like, whoa, like Markan Priority kind of appearing on the scene is also very suspect. Like, what is going on here? And realizing that Markan Priority wasn't the dominant view, how it was formed, the arguments started to fall apart. And eventually, and the arguments just get better the deeper you go. And once you start to get into like the textual analysis and the linguistic analysis of the Hebrew and the Greek, which I need more Hebrew classes to really do that. But I have read Helva Ronning's PhD. I've read works on the Jerusalem Perspective website and on lukanprimacy.com. It just is like, it's nuts. It's like a commoner could read this and be like, oh yeah, you're right. You know,
Yeah, there's so much evidence.
yeah. It's like overwhelming.
The
Honestly,
more
how
you
much
dig
evidence
into
there
it, the
is.
more convicted you become. Like it's just so overwhelming. Yeah, and I'm trying to summarize it all as much as it makes sense to, like all the work of Jerusalem Perspective on my website, Lukan Priority. So that has been my passion. I hope to write a book here eventually
Yeah.
on the topic as well. So
Well,
we'll see.
I want to talk
who's
about that
first.
too as well. So the reason why there's not a lot of published literature, I won't say any names, but I know very, very qualified scholars that not secretly, but like they believe in Lukan Priority, but they can't publish works on it because the dogma of Markan Priority is so strong that they won't get published by Brill and other
Oh, really?
publications.
That
So
is, yeah,
it's
this
a
is key. This
problem.
is key information. Newsflash. You come out in this day and age as, Lukan Priority, and your book is shadow banned, or it's a
You're seen as a
non-starter.
kook, even though the people making these arguments could talk circles, just basic, these people can sight read Greek and Hebrew, and a lot of these PhD scholars can't. Like people come out of PhD programs forgetting how to sight read Greek.
Uh-huh.
What?
So
I don't know. Throw a random text in front of Bart Ehrman and see if he can sight read it. Can't.
so at least one PhD, heavyweight scholar. How many would you say? Is there more than
There's
one?
actually two. There's actually two that have said this. And it's unfortunate. They're getting a bit more. Some of them are getting a bit more brash and saying it in like public lectures and stuff like that at like different universities. And some of these professors were like tenured professors that I know of at big universities that believe this, but they don't want to get. They have other books they want to get published, and they don't want to be like blacklisted or.
So what's the
seen as
reason in
silly.
blacklisting scholarship? Because the golden age of critical scholarship was the early 1900s, where there seemed to be more freedom in coming up with arguments and different perspectives on.
Yeah.
Why does everyone there's the established consensus of Markan Priority, and why is it such an impenetrable barrier
Because
to
the last
question that?
150 years of New Testament academia is built on Markan Priority. So if you take that piece out,
So it's people's reputations
crumbles.
that hang on the line.
Yeah,
Because if you
people that.
question Markan Priority, you undermine.
Yeah. I spent my whole life on this PhD. That's garbage.
Yeah, there's
The internet is a
definitely.
powerful thing, though. The internet and social media in the last 20 years, this stuff getting shared, it's going to start to increase awareness. Because I think what I want to have grace for is scholars who were taught this, dug into it, and they weren't given the tools to fight against it. You don't know what you don't know, and so people that are investigating this, they may not always have their perspective, and they're ignorant in a way that I'm ignorant on so many topics, right? And so it's very possible that these people were well-meaning and they just really are misinformed. And I don't want to be presumptuous because I also want to hold in contention that Lukan Priority could possibly be wrong, and we're just we just gaslit ourselves or something. I don't know, right? It's like, which I don't think is true, but like, a little bit of epistemic humility here. Like, I do think that people really do believe that, and they just make mistakes. Like,
But yeah, there's a lot of egos involved, and there's just the tradition. Like, it's so hard to change textbooks, and if you standardize a curriculum to, it's like a whole total paradigm shift. And I think most scholars and theologians, that's a can of worms they don't want to have to deal with. It's arduous. There's so many technical considerations. It's really a complex, the realm of textual criticism and higher scholarship. It's really an area that a lot of people don't want to go. It's uncomfortable, and why put your reputation on the line to do something that's taboo in a sense? It's against the grain. It's going it's going upstream. So I think it's just easier to blend in with the crowd and differentiate yourself on some other issue that's more safe.
Well, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think what you're digging at is when you take this piece out, again, it's interconnected to so much scholarship of understanding who Jesus is. People's tons of dissertations are built off of the dissertations way over here have like root lines all connected back to, well, Mark is the first gospel, and that's like the more accurate version of Jesus, or like the more primitive and the less embellished or whatever. And that has massive ramifications
Yeah,
for
the
New Testament
implications.
scholarship.
Yeah, exactly. And also the implications of Luke is first, that Mark and Matthew are highly embellished accounts of that narrative, that primitive narrative. And so then that opens up the question of reliability and historical value. If Mark and Matthew are shown to have much less historical value of the historical Jesus, then you have a question of, okay, your reliability of the canon. It brings in the question of canon itself. Like, why do we have 4 gospels in the canon? In terms of Matthew versus Luke, it's really detrimental to Matthew if Luke predates Matthew. If you have a view of Matthew and posteriority, that really undermines Matthew to a large degree. If you view that Luke is just simply a redaction of Matthew, it's easier to kind of put them on a level playing field. But if Luke predates even Mark, then you really have a huge question in terms of Matthew having
and each pericope
historical value.
Yeah, each pericope has got to be weighed on its own, because there's stuff in each gospel that's unique content. I struggle with the whole idea of a canon. I'm still working that out because I'm not Catholic. My Catholic friends have really challenged me on the canon, because I think, non-Catholic views of the canon are pretty bad, in my opinion. And I'm among them. So, I'm still trying to work out, how do I have an authoritative text? How do I get there? How do I get outside of myself with authoritative text? Like, how?
Yeah, if you were to define a canon within the canon of foundational witnesses that have higher historical value, or of the highest level of accuracy of the historical Jesus and apostolic Christianity, what books would be part of that core canon?
Well,
if you had to pick a gospel, which one would it be? It would obviously be Luke.
Yep.
Supplemented with Acts. And Paul's obviously the earliest writings, the earliest letters. So Luke, Acts plus Paul, wouldn't that be core? So that's the conviction I have.
Well, how do you get Paul's letters, though?
Well, they're early. They're within a few decades of Christ's resurrection, and so
the only problem I have is, though, that seems arbitrary. I think the Gospels are fine, because you could say that the words of Jesus are self-authenticating, because they're reliably citing historical words that happened. Let's just give Luke, for example. They're self-authenticating. They're perfectly circular, and they're perfectly logical to remain that way, because the words of Jesus are coming from some sort of messenger of God or something like that. Jesus is an elevated figure, whatever your view of Jesus is. But Paul, he's not Jesus. He's some other guy, and he's writing these works. Catholics can just say, like, "Well, church tradition, we got it." But Protestants can't pull church tradition without pulling in the Pope. So I have a really hard time getting, those letters in there.
Well, if we're relying on Luke as the lens and the best resource for the historical Jesus, Luke is cross-validating with Paul. I mean, more than half of Acts pretty much covers Paul's ministry.
Ooh,
so that's
cool.
the problem you have.
That's really good.
So your source for the historical Jesus validates Paul's ministry and his legitimacy. as an apostle,
Hmm.
as someone uniquely called by Christ to be the apostle to the nations. So that's the problem you run into. But I think there's a lot in the closet. Yeah, you say there's two scholars. I really want to know who these people are. So yeah, I think that as we continue to push forward, there'll be more that come out of the closet. My ministry has a number of people have come, to that conviction as well through my websites and everything else. So I'm looking forward to working together and flushing out some of these details. Thanks again, Ryan. You have any final words you'd like to add?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I think, I'm sure I think we chatted a bit before, but I got kids. I also run a YouTube channel for like a popular Star Wars game called Star Wars Unlimited. So my life is so busy. I really wanted to go back to school, but as duty calls, I had to pay my bills and stuff like that. And I have a really great sort of corporate style job in marketing, and I love it. But I really like having these conversations. I don't get them as often anymore because I'm outside of the academic space. And I'm in the throes of littles. So I just really appreciate having the opportunity to just express myself, talk. It was really fun. And I'm sure for those watching, this can be a really interesting subject. They may not agree, but I hope that we started to chip away, because it's not about us being right. It's about primarily, it's also probing in questions and challenging the dogma that exists. And I think that endeavor alone,
Amen.
the endeavor of challenging and learning, is a very valuable endeavor in and of itself. So
praise the Lord. Thanks again. God bless everybody. See you next time.
yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Josiah. Bye.